In Acts chapter 17, towards the middle of the chapter, it details Paul being in Athens, Greece. Athens at the time, pretty much the birthplace of Western philosophy as we know it. I'm not going to read from the whole thing, but starting at 17, therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him. And some said, what will this babbler say? Others some, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And it goes on dealing details. Basically, the philosophers, they were used to hearing the different Greek paganism, the Greek philosophy, particularly Plato. Kind of the long and short of Plato, there's still a huge influence of Platonism on the Western world. Essentially, some of the main cores of it are that everything physical is bad, everything spiritual is good, and that you want to escape this material stuff and try to get to this immaterial spiritual stuff. Now, the majority of the other disciples and those that wrote the New Testament, most of them were fishermen, kind of just your blue collar type, everyday folks, never went to any sort of main schooling that we know of, just regular folks, except for Paul. Paul, from a very young age, he was taught the Old Testament, the only writings pretty much at that time. Paul knew the Old Testament like the back of his hand. I'm sure he could probably quote all the way from Genesis to Malachi. I'm sure he had it memorized. Paul was no dummy. Paul could stand his ground with anyone, either Jew or Gentile. The thing with Athens, Greece, and kind of Greek philosophy in general is it has had such an impact on the Western world that we don't really think about. Everything from our government to our architecture. You look at different courthouse buildings, monuments in Washington, D.C., just all across the place, how similar architecture, teachings, philosophies are to ancient Greece, ancient Athens, where Paul's at the time. And the folks that Paul's talking with here, they're not dummies. They're very well educated, and they spend every day, it talks about here, trying to learn everything that they can. And when he talks to them about Jesus and the resurrection, they want to know, what is this strange thing that you bring? With their Platonistic philosophical mindset of material bad, spiritual good, the concept of a resurrection, it's just something that it was new to their ears. There were no teachings on resurrection. There were no teachings on the meek inheriting the earth. Everything was spiritual, celestial. There wasn't anything like that. So Paul talking about resurrection was something brand new to them. Paul takes this opportunity to go ahead and witness to them, starts evangelizing, and he says in verse 23, for as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. Paul's on Mars Hill, the center of paganism and this essentially anti-God philosophies that were based upon human wisdom. And so he's in the midst of them. These guys ain't dummies that he's talking to. I mean, they know their history and their writings like the back of their hand, just as Paul knows the Old Testament. And it's just interesting to note some of the key points that he talks about. Jesus and the resurrection. And then he talks also in verse 24, God that made the world and all things therein. And it's very interesting to note that what Paul is saying to them absolutely applies today to what we're dealing with in the Western world and just the world in general. He tells them in verse 24, God that made the world and all things therein. What are we dealing with today? Lots of people saying that there is no God, that all this stuff just happened by chance. And there were a lot of different teachings in ancient Greece at that time, and the ancient Romans, that believed similar things, or some sort of pagan gods, multiple gods that created or what have you, tons of different teachings. Paul's saying no, there was one. There was one God, made the world and everything. And he continues on, verse 25, basically preaching about, hey, none of this idolatry. He says, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. He doesn't need legalism. He doesn't need people to like beat themselves, set on fire. Like all this stuff you look at, Buddhism, Hinduism, different philosophies, different religions that think there's some sort of thing by punishing their bodies that they can achieve some sort of nirvana in this oneness with the spirit and all this energy. Paul says, no. So They dealt with that back then, and they're dealing with this now. And continuing on to 26, very pertinent to today. And hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation. And then moving down to verses 31 and 32. Because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. And then the philosophers here. And when they had heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, we will hear thee again of this matter. What was it about the concept of the dead rising again that the philosophers of that time just had such a hard time believing and even wanting to hear it? And why is it that 2,000 years later, we still have a hard time talking about the resurrection? And the concept of the dead rising again is just something that it's ignored. It's just something that's not talked about. The Apostle Paul wasn't talking to them about streets of gold and pearly gates. He wasn't talking to them about living their best life now. He wasn't talking about proclaim it and claim it. Paul preached the resurrection of the dead. Why is that such a hard concept? Why is it a concept even today that it's a hard concept for people to talk about? Like I said in the last video, when's the last time you've been to a funeral and heard somebody talk about the resurrection of the dead? My favorite passage being from Job 19, just talking about his flesh rotting and then being reanimated and seeing God in his flesh in his own eyes. I love that passage. And I chose this spot for the view because I just love the view. I love the mountains, the grass, the trees, all this. And I have no idea what the world looked like before the flood came in and destroyed everything. Even in this fallen state, just how beautiful creation is. I just absolutely love it. And to see that restored again someday, it's just awesome. It's something to definitely look forward to. But that was a totally foreign concept to the philosophers of that day, just as it is to a lot of us in the Western world today, 2,000 years later. Why is that? Over the past 2,000 years after the New Testament was written, you had folks that were early church fathers that either knew the original apostles or knew folks that were disciples under them that would have different writings out. And then you had like the Council of Trent, Council of Nicaea, make different declarations of doctrine, what the church is going to believe. And then the church started intermingling with the government, and then different kings and emperors would declare, this is what we believe, this is what we teach. And then you move into different persecutions in this sect fleeing here, and then a lot of Gnosticism around Alexandria, Egypt, for example. Just lots of paganism was merged into Christianity, and then you had very famous writers such as Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to pronounce it, declaring certain things. Then these folks were once pagans, and they still mixed some of that in with their teachings. Generations pass, and this person teaches it, and then they teach it, and it moves along the line to where we get a number of different beliefs that we have in the church, and you ask yourself, okay, what passage does it say that? And you'd be surprised that there are quite a few teachings when it comes to our concept of heaven, our concept of eternal life in general, that a lot of this is based on Greek philosophy, teachings of Augustine, and even books like Dante's Inferno and Paradise Lost. A lot of our descriptions of heaven and hell come from Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno, and it's just been part of our culture for many generations that it's considered that's the truth, because unfortunately a lot of people don't read their Bible. I mean, honestly, those of you watching this, how many times have you read the Bible cover to cover? Seriously, just ask yourself that. How many times have you? If you haven't, you definitely need to. One of the main examples is six-sided in my mind of just how powerful a book can have on doctrine is the saying, the eagle will fall before the bear. I have heard that since I was a little kid, and just within the past year or so, I've heard an older person just very blatantly, the eagle will fall before the bear, America's going to fall before Russia, and they were dead set on that. And I'm sure most of you have heard that as well. You try to find that in the Bible, nowhere does it say that. Absolutely nowhere does it say that. But I know, again, since I was a little kid, that has been taught by a lot of folks as the doctrinal truth, and it's not in the Bible. There's a lot of concepts that we have that aren't in the Bible. But then when you talk about something such as, hey, resurrection, I'm going to get a new body, and I'm going to get the chance to farm forever, if I so choose people kind of look at you like, what, are you Jehovah's Witness or something? Because, I mean, unfortunately, they're a false teaching, but they're about the only ones that talk about the resurrection. And so a lot of people shy away from it, because I know I've been accused of that a number of times. Just for the record, I attend Church of God, Eastern Pennsylvania Conference. There was a guy named John Weinbrenner, in the 1800s that formed this congregation. I'm not like a strict, doctrinalist, but just in case you're wondering, that's who I belong to, the Church of God. I don't believe in everything that they do, but, that's pretty much what I consider myself, just your regular day-to-day Protestant evangelical. Other than the teachings on the resurrection, that's where I differ with most Protestant groups, because it's just something that it's ignored. Part of Paul's evangelizing to the pagan philosophers is referencing Genesis. And at some point, we have to reference Genesis when dealing with the pagan secular world of the West and the world in general. And so what do we believe on that? Because the concept of the resurrection, at some point, you have to go back to Genesis, because you have to ask yourself, the earth is going to be restored. Creation is going to be restored. We're going to be restored. What are we going to be restored to? You have to ask that question. And so you start going back in time, in the Bible. You start going back. Okay, last video talked about promises given to Abraham. Okay, Abraham's in Genesis. All right, we'll move on back. What happened before Abraham? We got the Tower of Babel, the different languages. Kind of a supernatural thing happened. Do you believe it? Do you believe that that's where the different languages come from the scattering, the dispersion of the nations at Babel? Do you believe that? Do you believe that God came and confused the different languages and spread out, and that's how we got the different nations and people groups? And then moving back beyond that, there was Noah's flood. Do you believe that all land-dwelling creatures that weren't inside the ark were completely destroyed, that the earth was completely covered in water? Do you believe that? And going on before that, then, you have the creation of Adam and Eve. The Bible says they were the very first ones and created. Adam created out of dust of the earth. Eve formed from his side, and God breathed into Adam, and he became a living soul. Do you believe that? Because in order for the concept of the resurrection and the restoration, what point does it go back to? In Revelation, when it talks about the paradise of God, same word, paradise, is used in Genesis. The garden, the paradise of God. In the Garden of Eden, you had the tree of life. In Revelation and other passages in the Bible, it talks about the tree of life. The tree of life is once again going to be available to believers to partake and live forever. Do you believe what it says in Genesis? Because for things to be restored to how they once were, believing in this resurrection, is that what it was? Or was it the millions of years and the eons and this gap theory and all this other stuff that these bestseller writers write up and a lot of the church believes? Kind of one of the magic wand fixes for this is a lot of folks will say, well, Adam and Eve, they were just the very first ones to have a soul. And then ding, all right, now they're restored to everything. Well, all right, when we talk about resurrection then, when everyone, both believers and non-believers, are going to be resurrected, so does that mean then that the prototypes before Adam and Eve that were partly human, partly ape, are they going to be resurrected? So they didn't have this immortal soul, but Adam and Eve then magically had this immortal soul, and then that made them fully human, but they've still got this ape DNA in them. So we're like, those ape people, are they not going to be resurrected? And then you continue on down. The descendants of Adam and Eve, there's these ape genes supposedly in them. Does Jesus Christ then have ape DNA in him? Because he was resurrected in a physical body. Now, I know going back 1,000, 2,000 years, there were some Gnostics starting to say that Christ shed his body at the ascension, which is completely unbiblical and it's a false teaching. But that's one of the ways that folks try to get over that and say, well, he's a spirit now. And that is a straight up false teaching. In fact, if you go to 1 John chapter 4, it says, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." And then in verse 2, "Hereby know ye the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. Verse 3, and every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. And this is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. The Apostle John was having to deal with a lot of the Gnostics, same thing that Paul was dealing with, that everything material was bad, everything spiritual was good. A lot of teachings at that time saying Christ shed his body at the ascension. And that is a false heresy. And the Apostle John's warning against that. Is come in the flesh. Essentially what that means is it's continuing. Like, it's not a past, did come in the flesh. No, it's continuous. He is in a resurrected body right now. At some point, you're going to have to make the decision, how much of the Bible do you believe versus what a philosophy is that you learned in school or you learned that was passed down through generations. What do you believe? The concept of a resurrection, of folks being restored to life, standing on earth, the earth being healed, probably not instantaneous. The resurrection will be instantaneous, but the process will probably be, my opinion, for a while. Covered that in the last video, but we don't know. Not going to be dogmatic about it. But if all this happened over millions of years, and that Adam and Eve were just the first people because magically they had this immortal, eternal soul put into them, and now all of a sudden then they're people, but the ones before them weren't. Like, you see how much confusion this adds in this whole gap theory. I used to believe the gap theory for a lot of years when I was a young man, and I don't anymore. But the reason I did was because I read a book by a prominent mainstream theologian. I trusted what he wrote. I took it as truth, and for a lot of years, that's how I kind of dealt with all this. But if you doubt the book of Genesis, what is your litmus test then? At what point then do you start believing the Bible?